Hi everybody, today I'm going to be talking you through how to produce a report in psychology. So looking in particular at SACE Stage 1 and Stage 2, the how to write a report guide I'm going to be talking through is specific to the Stage 2 collaborative investigation, but the same rule applies for Stage 1 and Stage 2, and I'll kind of highlight the differences as I go because they are very small. Now, this is what we get from SACE in terms of what the purpose of this assignment is. Now, when I think about the purpose of this, it's really about showing a deep understanding of the introduction to psychology content and showing that you can apply it to a research program. So really showing practical skills here and practical understanding of the content. When we talk about the components, we have a few. The first one is a proposal. This is basically a lie because we write this after we've collected data. But in the real world, before you're able to conduct any kind of research, particularly in a university setting, you have to put together a proposal first, which is either approved or denied. So we want to get you in the habit of writing a proposal. You then have to analyze data. And then when we're looking at the collaborative task at both Stage 1 and in Stage 2, you do this together in groups. So you get into groups and you decide on what you would like to focus on and you put together a proposal together, and you also analyse the data together as well. But once you have done that in both Stage 1 and Stage 2, you will also put together an individual report. Now the difference is for Stage 2, for the individual investigation, you do all of this on your own. So it just means at Stage 1 and also a bit of Stage 2 in the collaborative task, you just get a little bit more support in that team to help you through this. For the collaborative task, you also do a self and peer assessment, which helps us look at how you worked as a team. Word counts. So at Stage 2, we have a word count of 250 words max for the proposal, so it's quite short. The report has a maximum of 1,500 words. If you would like to present that differently, you need to negotiate that with the teacher, and you have a maximum of 10 minutes. And then the group review that you do, so again, this is only for the collaborative component, Stage 1 and 2, you do a little group review, which is basically where you review how you worked as a team, and that is 150 words. Here we are looking at what you are assessed on. And this here is the little peer assessment that I was telling you about before. So this is where you assess yourself and each member of your team. I then assess you and write a little comment, and this is where you write your really short review about how you worked as a team. This here is what you're assessed on. I really recommend that you go through at the A level, have a good look at what makes it different to the B level, and I'll also unpack this with you in class. Here is where we want to really begin. So this provides a nice overview of how the collaborative investigation actually works for both Stage 1 and Stage 2. Like I said, it's really confusing because we do things out of order to what you would normally do in the real world or in a university setting. Rather than doing the proposal first and proposing what we would like to do, we actually skip ahead and collect the data. So you've all done that now. We all collect the data. You then work as a team to decide on a hypothesis, or if you're doing a qualitative study, you do a research question. You then write the proposal together and you look at the results together as well. So all of this is done collaboratively. Obviously, for the independent investigation at Stage 2, you are only collecting data as a class. The rest you are doing independently. For the collaborative task though, by yourself, like I said, you need to produce your own report. So it needs to have an introduction, a discussion, and a conclusion. And when it comes time to presenting it in a document, it needs to go in this order. The participation assessments is just the peer and self-assessment I showed you before. Now every year, the chief assessor from SACE, he or she, they get to moderate all of the tasks that come from different schools, and they put together a bit of a report for things that they saw that were done really well and things that weren't done very well for a particular assessment type. There have been a few since 2016, but I particularly liked the tips from that year, found them most helpful, so I've put them here for you. I really recommend that once you've written your report, you have a brief look through here, just because they're going to give you some final tips before you submit about how to really get the most successful response possible. Okay, now in terms of writing the proposal, I'm going to skip through that because I have a separate video on how to do the proposal. Obviously, it's going to be different for every kind of report that you do in terms of its content, so pay attention to what is in the yellow rather than what's in the example. Now, let's look at the results, because the really important thing here is making sure that you know what kind of data you have and that you choose the most appropriate way to present that data. So if you have quantitative data, you're thinking about how you are going to present that, making sure you are doing that in as clear a way as possible and that you do not use any raw data. So we don't want the spreadsheet that the teacher has compiled for you. For qualitative data, you're going to be doing some content analysis and presenting that in a frequency table. So this is just to divide you initially depending on what kind of data you have. I then have a pretty comprehensive guide about how to present your data. Some of the main takeaways here are to select the appropriate graph type. Make sure it's really large. It should take up about a third to a half of the page. It should have a title. The axes should be labeled. The axes should also be in the correct place for the variables. You need to have a correct scale, so it needs to start at 0. You need to plot your data correctly, include a brief caption underneath about what the graph is showing. And then in your discussion, you need to be able to refer to said graph or table, which is why you have the caption. Really important that your reader should be able to make sense of the graph or table when they first look at it. It shouldn't need any explanation, and in fact the only written content that you need in the results is perhaps an explanation of how big your sample was. Okay. You really shouldn't need anything else. A couple of important notes: your standard deviation should never be put in a graph, it is always put in a table. And there was another point I was going to say, and now it's gone. So I'm sure it will be in this document somewhere, and if I can remember it, I'll tell you in class. Here's an example of a graph. Okay, so making sure it's got a nice big table and that it's really easy to read. For qualitative data, I have an example of a frequency table here for you to have a look at. And again, some really final tips here for what to do. Please take note of the decimal place. So we don't want decimals of more than 2. That's what I was going to say. You don't need to then explain or try and unpack what is in your graph or table. You really shouldn't be interpreting that at all. That should be in your discussion. So keep your results section really concise, really clear, and really to the point. So now comes the time where you need to do the rest of the report by yourself. So the introduction is basically the very beginning of your report. Your proposal is submitted separately and it's marked separately. And if you think about in the real world, your proposal is purely to see whether your research is going to be approved or denied. Once that has happened, the proposal isn't seen again. So in terms of the final paper that comes out, you need to provide your reader with an understanding of what happened, what research design was used, what was the sample, and how was the data collected. So there should be a lot of similarities between your proposal and your introduction, but the difference is the tense that you use. So the tense of your proposal should be future tense. So this will be done. This data will be collected. The introduction should be in past tense because you're writing it at the conclusion of your experiment. Here I have a bit of an ingredient list for what to include. So just a basic run through of what to include here. Most importantly, you need to make sure you identify your hypothesis initially or your research question, and also which research design you will be using. So be really specific to the study. Okay. For example, if you're using a quantitative observational investigation, how are the criteria pre-existing? You then need to talk about your sample, and you need to talk about how your data was obtained. Be careful when I say that, because what you don't want to do here is run through a method of what was done from beginning to end. What you need to do was talk about what method of assessment was used, or what measure. For example, was it a Likert scale that was in a standardized questionnaire? And what was it measuring? So for example, assertive thoughts. So being really specific about that. And then what is going to be, or what was done to the raw data, and then how were the data going to be presented? It's really important here not to describe the method, and there's no need to quote research from the background information, but sometimes it can just be a little bit helpful to be trying to talk about what the focus of the investigation is. So that's the introduction. Now comes the most important part of the paper, which is your discussion. This is where most of the marks come from, and it should be the largest section in terms of word count of your paper. This is where you need to interpret the results and you need to evaluate the results that were obtained. You also need to basically evaluate the study in general. So really apply the strengths and weaknesses, the advantages and disadvantages to your particular study and to your research in particular. Here is another long ingredient list for what to include. Please don't feel like you have to necessarily have them all in this order. You know, the criteria is that it needs to be in a logical order. This is just to make sure that you've included everything. Okay. Now, it makes sense to begin with your hypothesis and to talk about whether it was supported or not based on your results. Okay. Don't put figures in. Don't put data in. You need to refer to the figures or tables that you included in your results. You can also talk about the degree to which it addresses the hypothesis. You can say supported, not supported, but you can say, you know, it's supported to some degree, or it's supported, but maybe the difference in the results aren't significant enough to strongly support the hypothesis. Okay? Show the little nuances there in your understanding. You then need to evaluate the sample and talk about the size and the representativeness of that sample, and really being specific about, for your particular research question or your hypothesis, what factors are going to be most relevant. Obviously, every sample could always be bigger, but try and talk about things. It might be gender, it might be age, but pick something that's relevant for your particular focus. Really important all the way through your discussion, you need to be suggesting improvements, because that's actually one of your assessment criteria, is the ability to suggest appropriate improvements. So how would you change the sample? You also need to talk about reliability and validity. However, you don't have to have a separate paragraph for this. A lot of students decide to put it in their strengths and weakness paragraphs. So they talk about the validity and reliability of some of the measures, they talk about the results, and then they talk about some improvements. And that's a really great way to do it, really, because it shows that you're applying these terms without having to do it separately and on its own. So they need to be in there, which is why I've got them separately, but it's really good if you can embed those terms as you go. For strengths and weaknesses, really important that you don't talk about the sample again. Once you've done sample, do not revisit it again. You need to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the investigation design and the procedures that took place. So if you're feeling stuck, go back to your notes from Intro to Psych, look at the design and procedure notes of different investigation types and apply some of those to your study. Look at things like extraneous variables. Look at perhaps the participants. Was there any missing data? And again, really important that you suggest some possible improvements. Here, students will usually have one paragraph for strengths, one paragraph for weaknesses. Finally, you guys need to talk about ethics. Now, ethics is tricky because you don't want to talk about every single ethical guideline because you'll run out of words, but you also don't want to just do one. So I recommend that students choose one or two really relevant ethical guidelines that were met very well in the study and talk about those and apply them, and then pick one that perhaps wasn't done very well so that you can talk about a possible improvement and how that could be done better. You really need to be specific here, and you need to be thinking about those that are most relevant. So for example, if you were doing a study with some year 11s who happened to be under 16, were their parents, did you gain informed consent from parents? So choosing things that are highly relevant to your study. If you are doing a study, we don't, but if you are doing a study about mental health, are you making sure that participants' confidentiality is maintained? Because we know the stigma that surrounds mental health. So again, choosing ones that are really appropriate. Once you've done that, you need to then do your conclusion. And this can be quite short, but really important here is that you draw an overall conclusion and that you refer to the results, but you also take into consideration the points that you made in your discussion. What I see, a lot with students, unfortunately, is that in the discussion, they will rip the entire study to shreds. They will talk about how many weaknesses there were so many extraneous variables, the results weren't valid, they weren't reliable, the sample was terrible. But then what they would do in the conclusion is say, based on the results that were obtained, the hypothesis was supported. So there's an issue there because you're not showing a deep understanding of how the weaknesses within an experiment can actually affect the overall conclusion of the study. So draw on your results, also draw on what you've talked about in the discussion, and come to an overall conclusion about your research question or hypothesis. You could also include a bit of a generalization in terms of what the results mean for broader society, applying it to the real world. And you might also like to think about perhaps some future studies that could take place. Again, just offering some final future improvements. So that's it in terms of content. Like I said, it looks like a lot, but take it piece by piece and work through. And then when you're finished, you need to then look at formatting. So you need to obviously have a look back up here for the order that your information needs to go in, which I've listed just here. Scroll back down. You need to have a nice cover page which has stage 1 or stage 2 psychology, whether it's the collaborative or individual investigation, the name of the investigation, which you can get from your teacher, your name, your SACE number, and the total word count. You need to have the following subheadings just here. I've got some information about text in terms of fonts, etc. And then in terms of communication, the key here is that you need to be speaking writing very formally. Your proposal is the only thing that is in future tense. The rest should be in past tense. And you need to be writing in a way that's very clear, very logical, very concise, and very well structured. So paying careful attention to that as well. So I hope this has been really helpful. Like I said, for my classes, this document is available to you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in class.